Good morning. We're back for episode 78 of reading the Anarchist Handbook, organized by Michael Malice, for about 10 minutes a day. And we are getting toward the end. We're on page 314, starting about halfway down. Today, reading on John Hasnas, The Myth of the Rule of Law from 1995. And we'll just go ahead and start reading. Imagine the following scene. A first-year contracts course is being taught at the prestigious Harvard Law School. The professor is a distinguished scholar with a national reputation as one of the leading experts on Anglo-American contract law. Let's call him Professor Kingsfield. He instructs his class to research the following hypothetical for the next day. A woman living in a rural setting becomes ill and calls her family physician, who is also the only local doctor, for help. However, it is Wednesday, the doctor's day off, and because she has a golf date, she does not respond. The woman's condition worsens, and because no other physician can be procured in time, she dies. Her estate then sues the doctor for not coming to her aid. Is the doctor liable? Two of the students, Arnie Becker and Ann Kelsey, resolve to make a good impression on Kingsfield should they be called on to discuss the case. Arnie is a somewhat conservative, considerably egocentric individual. He believes that doctors are human beings who, like anyone else, are entitled to a day off, and that it would be unfair to require them to be at the beck and call of their patients. For this reason, his initial impression of the solution to the hypothetical is that the doctor should not be liable. Through his research, he discovers the case of Hurley versus Eddingfield, which establishes the rule that in the absence of an explicit contract, i.e., when there has been no actual meeting of the minds, there can be no liability. In the hypothetical, there was clearly no meeting of the minds. Therefore, Arnie concludes that his initial impression was correct and that the doctor is not legally liable. Since he has found a valid rule of law which clearly applies to the facts of the case, he is confident that he is prepared for tomorrow's class. Ann Kelsey is politically liberal and considers herself to be a caring individual. She believes that when doctors take the Hippocratic Oath, they accept a special obligation to care for the sick, and that it would be wrong and set a terrible example for doctors to ignore the needs of regular patients who depend on them. For this reason, her initial impression of the solution to the hypothetical is that the doctor should be liable. Through her research, she discovers the case of Cottenham versus Wisdom, which establishes the rule that in the absence of an explicit contract, the law will imply a contractual relationship where such is necessary to avoid injustice. She believes that under the facts of the hypothetical, the failure to imply a contractual relationship would be obviously unjust. Therefore, she concludes that her initial impression was correct and that the doctor is legally liable. Since she has found a valid rule of law which clearly applies to the facts of the case, she is confident she is prepared for tomorrow's class. The following day, Arnie is called upon and presents his analysis. Anne, who knows she has found a sound legal argument for exactly the opposite outcome, concludes that Arnie is a typical privileged white male conservative with no sense of compassion, who has obviously missed the point of the hypothetical. She volunteers, and when called upon by Kingsfield, criticizes Arnie's analysis of the case and presents her own. Arnie, who knows he has found a sound legal argument for his position, concludes that Anne is a typical female bleeding heart liberal, whose emotionalism has caused her to miss the point of the hypothetical. Each expects Kingsfield to confirm his or her analysis and dismiss the others as the misguided bit of illogic it so obviously is. Much to their chagrin, however, when a third student asks, "But who is right, Professor?" Kingsfield gruffly responds, quote, "When you turn that mush between your ears into something useful and begin to think like a lawyer, you will be able to answer that question for yourself," and moves on to another subject. What Professor Kingsfield knows, but will never reveal to the students, is that both Arnie's and Anne's analyses are correct. How can this be? Part 3. What Professor Kingsfield knows is that the legal world is not like the real world, and the type of reasoning appropriate to it is distinct from that which human beings ordinarily employ. In the real world, people usually attempt to solve problems by forming hypotheses and then testing them against the facts as they know them. When the facts confirm the hypotheses, they are accepted as true, although subject to reevaluation as new evidence is discovered. This is a successful method of reasoning about scientific and other empirical matters because the physical world has a definite, unique structure. It works because the laws of nature are consistent. In the real world, it is entirely appropriate to assume that once you have confirmed your hypothesis, all other hypotheses inconsistent with it are incorrect. In the legal world, however, this assumption does not hold. This is because, unlike the laws of nature, political laws are not consistent. The law human beings create to regulate their conduct is made up of incompatible, contradictory rules and principles. And as anyone who has studied a little logic can demonstrate, any conclusion can be validly derived from a set of contradictory premises. This means that a logically sound argument can be found for any legal conclusion. When human beings engage in legal reasoning, they usually proceed in the same manner as they do when engaged in empirical reasoning. They begin with a hypothesis as to how a case should be decided, and test it by searching for a sound supporting argument. After all, no one can, quote, reason directly to an unimagined conclusion. Without some end in view, there is no way of knowing what premises to employ or what direction the argument should take. When a sound argument is found, then, as in the case of empirical reasoning, one naturally concludes that one's legal hypothesis has been shown to be correct. And further, that all competing hypotheses are therefore incorrect. This is the fallacy of legal reasoning. Because the legal world is comprised of contradictory rules, there will be sound legal arguments available not only for the hypothesis one is investigating, but for other competing hypotheses as well. The assumption that there is a unique, correct resolution, which serves so well in empirical investigations, leads one astray when dealing with legal matters. Kingsfield, who is well aware of this, knows that Arnie and Anne have both produced legitimate legal arguments for the competing conclusions. He does not reveal this knowledge to the class, however, because the fact that this is possible is precisely what his students must discover for themselves if they are ever to learn to, quote, think like a lawyer. Part 4. Imagine that Arnie and Anne have completed their first year of Harvard and coincidentally find themselves in the same second-year class on employment discrimination law. During the portion of the course that focuses on Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the class is asked to determine whether Section 2000E-2A1, which makes it unlawful, quote, to fail or refuse to hire or to discharge any individual or otherwise to discriminate against any individual with respect to his compensation, terms, conditions, or privileges of employment because of such individual's race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, end quote. Permits an employer to voluntarily institute an affirmative action program giving preferential treatment to African Americans. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Arnie strongly believes that affirmative action programs are morally wrong and that what the country needs are colorblind, merit-based employment practices. In researching the problem, he encounters the following principle of statutory construction. When the words are plain, courts may not enter speculative fields in search of a different meaning, and the language must be regarded as the final expression of legislative intent and not added to or subtracted from on the basis of any extraneous source. In Arnie's opinion, this principle clearly applies to this case. Section 2000E-2A1 prohibits discrimination against any individual because of his race. What wording could be more plain? Since giving preferential treatment to African Americans discriminates against whites because of their race, Arnie concludes that Section 2000E-2A1 prohibits employers from voluntarily instituting affirmative action plans. Perhaps equally unsurprising, Anne has a strong belief that affirmative action is moral and is absolutely necessary to bring about a racially just society. In the course of her research, she encounters the following principle of statutory construction. Quote, "It is a familiar rule that a thing may be within the letter of a statute, and yet not within the statute, because not within its spirit, nor within the intention of its makers. And that an interpretation which would bring about an end at variance with the purposes of the statute must be rejected." Upon checking the legislative history, Anne learns that the purpose of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act is to, quote, is to relieve, quote, "the plight of the Negro in our economy," and, quote, "open employment opportunities for Negroes in occupations which have traditionally been closed to them." Since it would obviously contradict this purpose to interpret Section 2000E-2 to make it illegal for employers to voluntarily institute affirmative action plans designed to economically benefit African Americans by opening traditionally closed employment opportunities, and concludes that Section 2000E2 does not prohibit such plans. The next day, Arnie presents his argument for the illegality of affirmative action in class. Since Anne has found a sound legal argument for precisely the opposite conclusion, she knows that Arnie's position is untenable. However, having gotten to know Arnie over the last year, this does not surprise her in the least. She regards him as an inveterate reactionary who is completely unprincipled in pursuit of his conservative and probably racist agenda. She believes that he is advancing an absurdly narrow reading of the Civil Rights Act for the purely political end of undermining the purpose of the statute. Accordingly, she volunteers, and when called upon, makes this point and presents her own argument demonstrating that affirmative action is legal. Arnie, who has found a sound legal argument for his conclusion, knows that Anne's position is untenable. However, he expected as much. Over the past year, he has come to know Anne as a knee-jerk liberal who is willing to do anything to advance her mushy-headed left-wing agenda. He believes that she is perversely manipulating the patently clear language of the statute for the purely political end of extending the statute beyond its legitimate purpose. Both Arnie and Anne know that they have found a logically sound argument for their conclusion, but both have also committed the fallacy of legal reasoning by assuming that under the law there is a uniquely correct resolution of the case. Because of this assumption, both believe that their argument demonstrates that they have found the objectively correct answer, and that therefore the other is simply playing politics with the law. The truth is, of course, that both are engaging in politics, because the law is made up of contradictory rules that can generate any conclusion. What conclusion one finds will be determined by what conclusion one looks for, i.e., by the hypothesis one decides to test. This will invariably be the one that intuitively, quote, feels right, the one that is most congruent with one's antecedent, underlying political and moral beliefs. Thus, legal conclusions are always determined by the normative assumptions of the decision maker. The knowledge that Kingsfield possesses and Arnie and Anne have not yet discovered is that the law is never neutral and objective. And that concludes Section 4. We'll hold off till tomorrow for Section 5, about halfway through on page 319. Concluding our approximately 10 minutes today, reading the Anarchist Handbook organized by Michael Malice. And we'll see you back soon. Have a good Friday the 13th.